Edinburgh, Scotland, November 1827. A cold, foggy night in the old town. The narrow closes, those dark, twisting alleyways that wind through Edinburgh's ancient heart, are slick with rain and filth. The fog rolls in from the Firth of Forth, thick and suffocating, turning the gas lamps into dim, ghostly eyes, watching from the darkness. This is a city of two faces. Up on the hill, the new town gleams with Georgian elegance. Wide streets, grand buildings, the enlightened world of science and progress. But down here, in the old town, it's a different world entirely. A medieval labyrinth of crumbling tenements, 15 stories high, packed with the poor, the desperate, and the forgotten. On a street called Tanner's Close, there's a lodging house, a cheap place, filthy, where a bed costs a few pennies and no questions are asked. The kind of place where people come when they have nowhere else to go. Tonight, an old man arrives at the door. His name is Donald. He's a military pensioner, a former soldier, his body worn down by years of service and harder years of poverty. He's looking for a bed, just a place to sleep for the night, somewhere warm, somewhere out of the rain. The landlord opens the door. His name is William Hare. He's a short, stocky man with a hard face and eyes like a predator sizing up prey. But tonight, he's all smiles. Come in, he says, his Irish accent thick and friendly. We've got room for you, old fellow. Inside, the lodging house is cramped and dark. A fire burns in the grate, and the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey fills the air. At a table sits another man, William Burke. Taller than Hare, better looking, with a charm that makes people trust him. He's the kind of man who can talk his way into or out of anything. He looks up as Donald enters, and his eyes gleam with interest. Sit down, friend, Burke says, pouring a cup of whiskey. You look like you could use a drink. Donald sits. He's grateful for the warmth, for the company. He drinks the whiskey Burke offers him. It's good whiskey, strong, free. He laughs, tells stories of his days in the army, of battles fought and comrades lost. Burke and Hare listen, smile, pour him another drink. Donald doesn't notice the look that passes between them, a glance, a nod, an understanding that needs no words. He doesn't see Burke's hand move to his coat pocket, checking something there. He doesn't see Hare stand up and quietly lock the door. He doesn't know that he's not a guest. He's inventory. By morning, Donald is dead. But not from natural causes, and his body won't be going to a cemetery. It's going somewhere far more valuable, somewhere that pays in gold. The dissection table of Dr. Robert Knox, Edinburgh's most famous anatomist. This is where it begins. Not with stealing the dead from their graves, but with creating corpses to order. This is where two desperate men discover that murder is easier than honest work and far more profitable. This is the story of how grave robbers became serial killers, how a lodging house became a slaughterhouse, how the pursuit of medical knowledge created a market for human flesh, and how two men were more than happy to supply it. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered, if you think the horrors hidden in the fog should be brought into the light, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep digging into the mysteries that history tried to bury. Tonight, we descend into the gas-lit streets of Victorian Edinburgh. We'll follow two men, William Burke and William Hare, from desperate Irish immigrants to the most infamous murderers in Scottish history, from their first body to their final victim, from the anatomy theatre where progress demanded corpses, to the trial that shocked a nation, to the gallows where one of them would pay the price. This is not just a story about murder. It's about what happens when science needs bodies faster than death can provide them. About two men who discovered that the dead were worth more than the living. About a city that turned a blind eye until the horror became impossible to ignore. This is the story of the body snatchers of Edinburgh. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand how Burke and Hare became monsters, you must first understand the city that created them. Edinburgh, in the 1820s, called itself the Athens of the North. It was a city of enlightenment, of philosophy, of science. The Scottish Enlightenment had made Edinburgh one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. Great minds gathered here. Medical schools flourished. The University of Edinburgh was producing some of the finest doctors and surgeons in the world. But enlightenment casts long shadows, and in those shadows, darker things were happening. The city was a place of brutal contradictions. In the new town, the wealthy lived in elegant Georgian townhouses, attended lectures on natural philosophy, and discussed the latest scientific discoveries over fine wine. But in the old town, the medieval heart of the city, the poor lived stacked on top of each other in crumbling tenements that rose 15 stories into the smoke-filled sky. Disease was rampant. Cholera, typhus, and consumption killed thousands every year. The closes, those narrow, winding alleyways, were open sewers, running with filth and desperation. This was a city where the distance between wealth and poverty, between progress and degradation, was measured in a 10-minute walk. And it was in this divided city that the science of anatomy was advancing at an extraordinary pace. Surgery was no longer butchery. It was becoming an art, a science. Doctors needed to understand the human body in intimate detail. They needed to know how muscles attached to bone, how organs connected, how the intricate machinery of human life actually worked. And that meant they needed bodies, lots of bodies. Here was the problem. The law said that the only bodies that could legally be used for anatomical dissection were the corpses of executed criminals. But Scotland didn't execute many people, perhaps 1 or 2 a year. Meanwhile, the medical schools of Edinburgh had hundreds of students, all desperate to learn, all needing hands-on experience cutting open human cadavers. The math didn't work. 1 or 2 bodies per year. Hundreds of students, dozens of anatomy lecturers, competing for those students' fees. The demand was insane. The supply was almost non-existent. And so, a black market was born. A market for human flesh. A market supplied by men who came to be known as resurrection men. Grave robbing became an industry. Under cover of darkness, men with shovels would creep into Edinburgh's graveyards. Greyfriars, Canongate, Calton Hill. They would find the fresh graves, the ones where the earth was still loose, where the bodies hadn't yet started to rot. They would dig, quietly, quickly. They would pry open the coffin, pull out the corpse, strip it of its burial clothes. Stealing a body wasn't technically illegal, but stealing the clothes was theft. And then fill the grave back in, leaving it looking undisturbed. Then they would stuff the naked corpse into a sack, sling it over their shoulder, and carry it through the foggy streets to the back door of an anatomy school. And there, a surgeon or a lecturer would be waiting, ready to pay, no questions asked. It was a lucrative trade. A fresh corpse could fetch anywhere from £7 to £10, more than a labourer could earn in 3 months of back-breaking work. The resurrection men became organised, territorial, violent. Rival gangs fought over graveyards. Some families became so terrified of having their loved ones stolen that they built iron cages over the graves, mort safes they were called, to keep the body snatchers out. The anatomists knew where the bodies came from. They had to, but they didn't ask questions. They needed the specimens. Their reputations, their incomes, their very careers depended on having a steady supply of corpses for their students to dissect. It was an open secret. Everyone knew. No one stopped it. And into this world of corpses and commerce stepped one man who would come to dominate Edinburgh's anatomy trade, Dr. Robert Knox. Robert Knox was a brilliant man, and he knew it. In his early 40s, he was Edinburgh's most popular anatomy lecturer. He was charismatic, theatrical, a showman as much as a scientist. His lectures were packed, over 500 students crammed into his anatomy theatre, hanging on his every word as he dissected corpses with the precision of an artist and the flair of a performer. He had studied in Paris, learned from the best anatomists in Europe, and returned to Edinburgh determined to make his mark. And he did. His classes were the most sought after in the city. Students paid good money to attend, and with that money, Knox lived well. Fine clothes, a grand house, a reputation that put him at the centre of Edinburgh's medical elite. But all of this depended on one thing: bodies. Knox needed at least 3 fresh corpses every week to keep his lectures running. 3 per week, every week, for months on end during the teaching season. That's over 100 bodies a year, and the law only provided 1 or 2. So Knox, like every other anatomist in the city, relied on the resurrection men. He paid top price, up to £10 for a really fresh specimen, one that hadn't started to decay, one that his students could learn from before the rot set in. And he asked no questions. Ever. This was the unspoken rule of the trade. Don't ask where the body came from. Don't ask whose grave was robbed. Don't ask if the family is still searching for their loved one. Just pay, take the corpse, and get on with the science. Knox told himself, and perhaps believed, that he was advancing human knowledge, that the work he was doing would save lives in the future, that the bodies he dissected were in service of a greater good. But the truth was simpler. Knox needed bodies, and he didn't care how he got them. And that made him the perfect customer for 2 men who were about to discover an easier way to supply the demand. William Burke and William Hare were not, at first glance, the kind of men who would become infamous murderers. They were small-time, unremarkable, just 2 more Irish immigrants trying to survive in the slums of Edinburgh. Burke was the charmer. Born in Ireland, he had worked as a baker, a weaver, even served as a soldier for a time. He was well-spoken, likable, the kind of man who could sell you something and make you feel good about it. He had come to Edinburgh with his common-law wife, Helen MacDougall, looking for work, looking for a better life. He found neither. He ended up doing odd jobs, labouring on the Union Canal, hauling goods, anything that paid. Hare was rougher, harder. He had come to Scotland and ended up running a cheap lodging house on Tanner's Close with his wife, Margaret. It was a grim place, a flop house for the desperate and the destitute, where a bed cost a few pence and the smell of unwashed bodies was permanent. Hare was the kind of man who saw the world in terms of what he could take from it. He was cunning, ruthless, and always looking for an angle. The two men became friends, or at least partners. They drank together, schemed together, survived together in the grinding poverty of Edinburgh's underworld. And then, in late 1827, opportunity knocked on Hare's door. An old man named Donald, an army pensioner, a regular lodger at Hare's boarding house, died in his sleep. Natural causes. Old age, probably, or disease. It happened all the time in places like this. The poor died quietly, unmourned, and were buried in paupers' graves. But Donald owed Hare £4 in back rent. £4 that Hare would never see if the old man went into the ground. Hare stared at the body, thinking, and then an idea formed. A dark, opportunistic, terrible idea. He knew that the anatomists paid for bodies. He'd heard the stories of the resurrection men, the money they made digging up corpses. But grave robbing was hard, dangerous work. The graveyards were guarded. Families were watching. The risk was high. But here was a body, right in front of him, free for the taking. No digging required. Hare went to Burke with the idea. They would steal Donald's body and sell it to one of the anatomy schools. Split the money, recoup the lost rent, and then some. Burke agreed. What did they have to lose? That night, they pulled Donald's corpse from the coffin that was supposed to carry him to burial. They filled the coffin with bark and stones to give it weight, then nailed it shut. The next day, the coffin was buried, empty, and no one was the wiser. Burke and Hare stuffed Donald's body into a sack and carried it through the dark streets of Edinburgh, up to the grand anatomy rooms of Dr. Robert Knox at Surgeons Square. They knocked on the back door. An assistant opened it, took one look at the sack, and let them in without a word. Dr. Knox himself came to inspect the goods. He looked at the body. Fresh, no signs of decay, no marks of violence. Perfect. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't ask how they got it. He just reached into his pocket and counted out £7 and 10 shillings. Burke and Hare stared at the money in their hands, more than either of them had seen in months, for one night's work. No digging, no risk. They looked at each other, and the same thought occurred to both of them, unspoken but perfectly understood. Why wait for people to die naturally? Burke and Hare left Dr. Knox's that night as different men. They had stumbled onto something extraordinary. A way to make more money than they had ever dreamed of, with almost no effort. The resurrection men had to dig up graves, risk getting caught, fight off rival gangs, deal with decomposing bodies that were barely usable. But Burke and Hare had discovered something simpler. Fresh bodies were worth more. And making a fresh body was easier than digging one up. The idea was too tempting, too easy, too profitable. All they needed was a victim, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone whose death would go unnoticed in a city where people died every day. And in the slums of Edinburgh, there was no shortage of people like that. A few weeks later, another lodger arrived at Hare's boarding house. His name was Joseph. He was a miller, a poor man, sick with a fever. He was coughing, weak, barely able to stand. He had come to Edinburgh looking for work, but found only illness. Hare let him in, gave him a bed, gave him whiskey to help with the fever. And that night, as Joseph lay in his bed, too weak to fight, too drunk to understand what was happening, Burke and Hare stood over him. They looked at each other. No words were needed. The grave robbers were about to become murderers, and Dr. Knox, waiting in his anatomy theatre, would never ask where the next body came from. It happened in February 1828, a cold, dark night in the lodging house on Tanner's Close. Joseph the miller lay in his bed, delirious with fever, his body weakened by illness and cheap whiskey. He didn't see Burke and Hare approach. He didn't understand what was happening when one of them pressed a hand over his mouth and nose, and the other held down his arms. He struggled weakly for just a moment, then his body went limp. It was over in minutes. No screaming, no blood, no mess. Burke and Hare stood over the body, breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had just crossed a line that most men never even approach. They had killed a man, not in a fight, not in passion, but deliberately, coldly, for profit. And yet, they felt no horror, no guilt, only a kind of dark excitement, because they had just invented the perfect murder. They called it Burking. The method was simple, efficient, and left almost no evidence. One man would grab the victim from behind, pinning their arms. The other would press down hard over the victim's nose and mouth, cutting off all air. The victim would struggle for a few seconds, maybe a minute, and then suffocate. No stab wounds, no bruises, no signs of violence. To a doctor in the 1820s, with no understanding of forensic pathology, the body would look like it had died of natural causes, a heart attack, a stroke, respiratory failure, just another corpse. And that's exactly what Dr. Knox saw when Burke and Hare delivered Joseph's body to his anatomy theatre the next day. Knox examined the corpse. Fresh, very fresh. No decomposition at all. The muscles were still pliable, the organs intact, perfect for dissection, perfect for teaching. He handed over £10, no questions, no suspicions, just money, and a silent understanding that more would be welcome. Burke and Hare walked out of Surgeon Square with a fortune in their pockets and a terrible new knowledge in their minds. Murder was easy, and it paid. Over the next few months, Burke and Hare refined their system. They became efficient, methodical, almost businesslike about it. Their targets were always the same: the vulnerable, the invisible, the forgotten. The people Edinburgh had already discarded. Street prostitutes, who disappeared all the time and were never reported missing. Elderly beggars, whose deaths were expected, unremarkable. The homeless, the sick, the desperate. People who lived in the margins, whose absence would be noticed by no one. Burke, with his charm and his easy smile, was the lure. He would find a victim in a tavern, on the street, in the dark corners of the old town. He would offer them a drink, a place to stay, a meal. "Come back to my lodgings," he would say. "It's warm. There's whiskey. You look like you could use some company." And they would follow him, because Burke was kind, Burke was friendly, Burke looked like someone you could trust. He would bring them back to Hare's lodging house, or sometimes to his own place. They would drink together, laugh together. Burke would keep pouring the whiskey, free and generous, until the victim was too drunk to think clearly, too intoxicated to fight. And then, in the dark, when the victim was barely conscious, Burke and Hare would strike. One would hold them down, the other would suffocate them. Quick, quiet, efficient. By morning, the body would be in a tea chest or a sack, and Burke would be carrying it through the streets to Dr. Knox's back door. Knox would pay £7, £8, sometimes £10 if the body was particularly fresh. And the cycle would begin again. But Burke and Hare were not working alone. This wasn't just two men committing murder in secret. It was a family business. Margaret Hare, William Hare's wife, knew everything. She helped lure victims, especially women. She would befriend them, gain their trust, bring them back to the lodging house. She would sit with them, pour them drinks, laugh at their jokes, and then stand aside when her husband killed them. Helen McDougall, Burke's common-law wife, was also complicit. She helped dispose of bodies, helped clean up the blood, helped keep the secret. There's debate about how much she knew at first, but by the end, there was no question. She was part of it. This was a conspiracy, a network of murder, and every one of them was guilty. The first few victims were strangers, easy to forget, easy to justify, if justification was even necessary. But then, the killings started to escalate. Abigail Simpson was next, a street prostitute known to Burke and Hare from the taverns. They lured her back, got her drunk, killed her, sold her to Knox. £10. Then an Englishwoman they called English Mary. Another prostitute, another body, another payment. Then Effie, a cinder gatherer, a woman who picked through the ashes of coal fires looking for bits of fuel to sell. She was old, sick, poor. No one would miss her. Each murder became easier. The hesitation, the fear, the moral boundary that most humans never cross. Burke and Hare had crossed it so many times now that it didn't even register anymore. Burke would later say with chilling simplicity, "It was like killing chickens." The bodies piled up, and Dr. Knox kept buying. In April 1828, Burke and Hare made a mistake. They killed someone who would be remembered. Her name was Mary Patterson, and she was beautiful, young, barely 18, with a face that turned heads even in the grim streets of Edinburgh. She was a prostitute, yes, but well known, popular, the kind of woman people noticed. Burke found her in a tavern, drunk and laughing. He convinced her and her friend to come back to his lodgings for more drink. The friend left. Mary stayed. She was dead within the hour. Burke and Hare delivered her body to Dr. Knox's dissection room the next morning, and when Knox's students saw her on the table, several of them recognized her immediately. "That's Mary Patterson," one whispered. "I saw her just yesterday." There were murmurs, questions. How did she end up here so quickly? How did she die? Dr. Knox moved quickly to shut down the questions. He claimed the body had come from the west of Scotland, that it had been transported overnight. He even preserved Mary's body in whiskey, keeping it in his private collection. A beautiful specimen, he said, for further study. But the truth was simpler and far darker. Knox knew. He had to know. Mary's body was too fresh, too perfect, too convenient. She had died hours before being delivered to his door. But Knox said nothing, asked nothing. He had his specimen, and that was all that mattered. The students' suspicions faded. The dissection continued. And Burke and Hare collected their £8. If Mary Patterson should have been a warning, the murder of Daft Jamie Wilson should have been the end. Jamie was a well-known figure in Edinburgh. He was a young man, perhaps 18 or 19, with a severe intellectual disability. Everyone in the old town knew him. He wandered the streets, talked to himself, smiled at strangers. He was harmless, childlike, beloved in his own way. People looked out for Jamie, but Burke and Hare didn't care. In October 1828, they lured Jamie to a lodging house, got him drunk, and killed him just like all the others. They delivered his body to Dr. Knox the next day, and once again, the students recognized him immediately. "That's Daft Jamie," several of them said, shocked. "What's he doing here?" This time, the murmurs were louder. The questions were harder to dismiss. Knox's assistants panicked. They told Knox that the students were getting suspicious, that people would start asking where Jamie had gone. Knox's response? He told them to dissect the head and feet first, the most recognizable parts, so that the body would be harder to identify. Then he told his students that the corpse was from the west of Scotland, just like he'd said about Mary Patterson. It was a lie. Everyone in that room knew it was a lie, but no one reported it. No one went to the police. No one stopped the dissection. Because medical education was more important than the life of a disabled man. Because science needed bodies, and asking questions would dry up the supply. Because Dr. Robert Knox was too important, too respected, too powerful to accuse. And so Daft Jamie was cut apart, studied, discarded, and Burke and Hare walked away with their payment, knowing they were untouchable. By late 1828, Burke and Hare had killed at least 16 people, 16 human beings, murdered for £7 to £10 each. They were making a fortune, more money than they had ever dreamed of. They were spending it freely, drinking in taverns, buying new clothes, living like men of means. And they were getting careless. The murders were happening more frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single week. The bodies were being delivered to Knox so regularly that his assistants had a routine for receiving them. No questions, just payment and a nod. Burke and Hare had become efficient, professional. They had turned murder into a business model, and business was booming. But they had forgotten something important. Every system, no matter how perfect, has a flaw. Every secret, no matter how well kept, eventually finds its way into the light, and their flaw was about to walk through the door. October 31st, 1828. Halloween night. An Irish woman named Marjorie Campbell Doherty arrived in Edinburgh, looking for relatives. She was asking around the old town for anyone with the name Doherty. It was her family name, and she hoped to find distant cousins, maybe a place to stay. William Burke heard her asking, and he saw an opportunity. "Doherty," he said, all smiles and charm. "That's my mother's maiden name. We might be related. Come, have a drink with me. Stay at my lodgings tonight. It's too late to be wandering the streets." Marjorie was delighted. She thought she'd found family, a connection to home, a stroke of luck. She had no idea she'd just met her killer. But this time, Burke and Hare weren't alone. There were other lodgers staying at Burke's place that night. A man named James Gray and his wife, Anne. Witnesses. Burke tried to get rid of them, forced them to leave for the night, told them to come back in the morning. They left, confused and suspicious. And when they returned the next day, Marjorie Doherty was gone. And Burke's explanations didn't make sense. The Greys started asking questions. Too many questions. And for the first time in nearly a year of perfect murders, Burke and Hare's system was about to collapse. The body snatchers' luck had finally run out. The morning of November 1st, 1828, James and Anne Gray returned to William Burke's lodgings on Tanner's Close. They had been forced out the night before. Burke had insisted they leave, told them to find somewhere else to sleep, given them money for a room elsewhere. It had been strange, aggressive, wrong. Now they were back, and the atmosphere was even stranger. Burke and Helen McDougall were nervous, agitated. They told the Greys not to go near the bed in the corner, not to touch anything, to mind their own business. The more Burke insisted, the more suspicious Anne Gray became. When Burke and Helen left the room for a moment, Anne couldn't resist. She walked over to the bed and lifted the straw mattress. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, hidden beneath the bed, was the body of a woman. The same Irish woman they had met the night before, Marjorie Docherty. Her face was pale, her eyes still open, her body still warm. Anne Gray screamed. James grabbed his wife and pulled her out of the room. They ran, stumbling through the narrow closes, desperate to find help. They found a police officer and, breathless and terrified, told him what they had seen. "There's a dead woman in Burke's lodging, hidden under the bed." The police moved quickly. Within the hour, they were at Burke's door. But when they searched the room, the body was gone. Burke, calm now, almost smug, told them that the Irish woman, Marjorie Docherty, had left that morning. She'd gone to look for her relatives. The Greys must have been mistaken. Perhaps they were drunk. Perhaps they were confused. The police looked around. No body, no blood, no evidence of anything wrong. But the officer in charge wasn't satisfied. The Greys had been too specific, too frightened. Something was wrong here. He decided to follow a hunch. He sent men to check the one place in Edinburgh where dead bodies always ended up, the anatomy schools. And at Surgeon Square, at the dissection rooms of Dr. Robert Knox, they found her. Marjorie Docherty's body was lying on a slab, ready to be cut open. She was still warm. She had been dead less than 12 hours. The police seized the body as evidence, and they came back for Burke and Hare with a charge that would shake Edinburgh to its core: murder. On November 2nd, 1828, William Burke, William Hare, Helen MacDougall, and Margaret Hare were all arrested and taken to the Calton jail. The news spread through Edinburgh like wildfire. Within hours, crowds began to gather outside the jail, shouting, demanding justice. Rumours swirled. How many had they killed? How long had this been going on? How many of the bodies that Dr. Knox had dissected had been murdered? The police began to dig into the case, and what they found horrified them. They interviewed Dr. Knox's assistants, who admitted that Burke and Hare had been regular suppliers for almost a year. The assistants described body after body being delivered, always fresh, always conveniently timed, always paid for without question. The police checked missing persons reports, cross-referenced them with the descriptions of bodies that had been dissected at Knox's school. Slowly, the pattern emerged. Daft Jamie Wilson, recognized by students, dissected anyway. Mary Patterson, recognized by students, dissected anyway. And more. So many more. Women, old men, the sick, the forgotten. People who had vanished from the streets and reappeared on Knox's dissection table. The number grew. 10 victims, 12, 15, 16. The police realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. A systematic campaign of murder conducted over months for profit. Burke and Hare hadn't killed in rage or passion. They had killed like businessmen fulfilling orders. And the man who had placed those orders, Dr. Robert Knox, had never asked a single question. The problem for the prosecution was evidence. Yes, they had Marjorie Docherty's body. Yes, they had witnesses who had seen it hidden in Burke's room. But proving murder was difficult. The cause of death, suffocation by burking, left almost no physical evidence. A skilled defense attorney could argue that Marjorie had died naturally, and Burke had simply panicked and tried to hide the body. As for the other murders, there was no physical evidence at all. The bodies had been dissected, destroyed. There were no witnesses to the killings. It would be nearly impossible to convict all four of them. The prosecutors knew they needed a confession, and they knew how to get one. They made an offer to William Hare: turn King's evidence, testify against Burke, tell us everything, and you will be granted immunity. You will walk free. Hare didn't hesitate. He had no loyalty to Burke, no sense of honor or friendship. Survival was all that mattered. He took the deal. Margaret Hare was also granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Helen McDougall's case was ruled not proven, a uniquely Scottish verdict that meant there wasn't enough evidence to convict her, but she wasn't declared innocent either. She was released, despised and shunned, to live with the shadow of what she had done. Only William Burke would stand trial for the murders. The charming Irishman with the easy smile, the man who had lured victims to their deaths with kindness and whiskey. He would face justice alone. The trial of William Burke began on December 24, 1828, Christmas Eve. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. People stood in the aisles, crammed against the walls, desperate to catch a glimpse of the man who had become the embodiment of evil. Burke sat in the dock, pale, quiet, his charm stripped away. He looked smaller now, diminished, like a man who knew his fate was already sealed. The prosecution's case was devastating. William Hare took the stand and, in a flat, emotionless voice, described everything. He told the court about Donald, the first body they had sold, about Joseph the miller, the first man they had murdered, about Abigail Simpson, Mary Patterson, Daft Jamie, all the others. He described the method, the burking, in clinical detail, how they would hold the victim down, cut off their air, wait for the struggling to stop, how they would stuff the bodies into sacks or tea chests and carry them through the streets to Dr. Knox's anatomy theatre, how Knox would pay them without asking where the bodies came from, how fresh they were, why they showed no signs of decay. 16 murders, 16 human beings, killed for money and sold for science. The courtroom sat in horrified silence as Hare spoke. This wasn't a crime of passion or madness. It was systematic, calculated, industrial. Burke and Hare had turned human life into a commodity. Burke's defense was weak, desperate. His lawyer tried to argue that Hare was lying, that he was the real killer, and was now framing Burke to save himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't believe Burke. No one believed Burke. After just 50 minutes of deliberation, the verdict came back: guilty. The judge, Lord Meadowbank, put on the black cap, the traditional symbol that a death sentence was about to be pronounced. "William Burke," he said, his voice cold and final, "you have been found guilty of one of the most heinous crimes ever to disgrace this city. You have murdered the innocent for profit. You have turned human life into merchandise. You have betrayed every principle of Christian morality and human decency." The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on Burke. "The sentence of this court is that you be taken from hence to the place from whence you came, and from there to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy upon your soul." The judge paused, and then delivered the final, crushing blow. "And thereafter, your body shall be publicly dissected and anatomized. Let your death serve as an example to others, and let your corpse serve the same purpose that you forced upon your victims." The irony was not lost on anyone in that courtroom. William Burke, the body snatcher, would become a body himself. The man who had sold corpses would be sold. The man who had delivered victims to the dissection table would end up on that table himself. It was poetic justice, terrible, perfect, and final. Burke was led from the courtroom in chains. The crowd outside erupted in cheers. Justice had been served, but the people of Edinburgh wanted more than justice. They wanted revenge. But what about the man who had bought all those bodies? What about Dr. Robert Knox, the anatomist who had paid for 16 murdered corpses and asked no questions? The police questioned him. They interviewed his assistants. They examined his records, and the truth was undeniable. Knox must have known. The bodies were too fresh. The timing was too convenient. The pattern was too obvious. But knowing and proving are different things. Knox claimed ignorance. He said he had trusted his suppliers, that he had assumed the bodies were obtained legally or through grave robbing. He said he had no way of knowing they were murdered. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. But it was a lie that couldn't be disproven in court. The prosecutors made a calculated decision. They couldn't convict Knox without destroying the entire medical establishment of Edinburgh. Too many other anatomists had done the same thing, bought bodies without asking questions. If Knox went down, the whole system would collapse. So they let him go. No charges, no trial, nothing. But the people of Edinburgh would not forgive so easily. Students began to riot outside his anatomy theatre. They burned effigies of Knox in the streets, chanting his name like a curse. His windows were smashed. His lectures were disrupted. Mobs gathered outside his home, baying for his blood. Knox's reputation was destroyed. His career was over. Within months, he was forced to leave Edinburgh, slinking away in the middle of the night like a criminal. He would spend the rest of his life moving from city to city, always one step ahead of the scandal that followed him. He died in London in 1862, bitter and forgotten, still insisting he had done nothing wrong. But Edinburgh remembered. Edinburgh would always remember. January 28th, 1829. Execution Day. William Burke was taken from the Calton jail in chains. The crowd that gathered to watch him die was massive. Estimates put it at over 25,000 people. They lined the streets, packed into every window, climbed onto rooftops. They weren't there for justice. They were there for spectacle, for revenge, for the satisfaction of seeing the monster destroyed. As Burke was led through the streets toward the gallows, the crowd roared. They threw stones, garbage, curses. They screamed for his blood. The guards had to form a tight circle around him just to get him through alive. Burke walked to the scaffold with his head down, his face pale. The charm was gone. The easy smile was gone. He was just a frightened man, about to die. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. A priest offered final prayers. Burke whispered something, perhaps a confession, perhaps a prayer of his own. And then the lever was pulled. The trapdoor opened. Burke dropped. The rope snapped taut. The crowd erupted in cheers as William Burke's body swung in the cold January air. But his punishment wasn't over, not even close. Because in death, William Burke would finally pay the price he had forced on so many others. The body snatcher was about to become the specimen. The merchant of corpses was about to be sold, and 25,000 people were about to watch him be torn apart, piece by piece, in the name of science. The day after the execution, William Burke's body was taken to the anatomy theatre of the University of Edinburgh. Not to Dr. Knox's rooms, Knox was far too controversial now, but to the official university facility where Professor Alexander Monroe would perform the dissection. But this would not be a normal anatomical demonstration. This would be a public spectacle, a final humiliation, a lesson to the entire city. The anatomy theatre was packed. Every seat was filled. Medical students, professors, members of the public who had paid for tickets, they all crowded in to watch. Thousands more lined up outside, waiting for their chance to view the body afterward. Professor Monroe stood over Burke's corpse, scalpel in hand, and began his work. He cut into Burke's chest, peeled back the skin, exposed the organs. He lectured as he worked, pointing out anatomical features, describing the function of each organ, treating Burke's body exactly as Burke had treated his victims, as a teaching tool, a specimen, a thing. The crowd watched in fascination. Some took notes, some sketched, some just stared, mesmerized by the sight of the infamous murderer being taken apart before their eyes. For hours, the dissection continued. Every organ was removed, examined, catalogued. Every bone was exposed. By the end, Burke was no longer a man. He was just pieces. And then came the final indignity. After the official dissection was complete, the public was allowed to file past Burke's body. They came in droves. Men, women, even children. They wanted to see the monster with their own eyes. They wanted to touch his skin, to stare into his dead face, to feel the satisfaction of knowing he was truly gone. But some wanted more than just to look. Burke's corpse became a source of souvenirs. His skin was removed, tanned, and turned into leather. A pocketbook was made from it. A small wallet, brown and worn, with a label that read, "Pocketbook made from the skin of William Burke, executed 28th of January, 1829. That pocketbook still exists today. You can see it in the Surgeons' Hall Museum in Edinburgh. Tourists come from around the world to stare at it, to photograph it, to marvel at the macabre relic of a monster. Death masks were made of Burke's face, plaster casts taken while the features were still recognizable. These were sold, collected, displayed in homes as grotesque curiosities. And his skeleton, it was carefully cleaned, articulated, and mounted for display. Even now, nearly 200 years later, William Burke's skeleton hangs in the Anatomical Museum at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. He's still there, still teaching, still serving the purpose he tried to exploit. The body snatcher became the eternal body. But what of the others? What happened to the people who had helped Burke commit his crimes? William Hare walked free. He had betrayed his partner, testified against him, and in return, he received immunity. No trial, no punishment, nothing. But freedom was not mercy. The moment Hare was released, the people of Edinburgh turned on him. Mobs formed, hunting for him, screaming for his blood. He couldn't walk the streets without being recognized, attacked, chased. He fled Edinburgh in disguise, hidden in the back of a cart, smuggled out of the city like contraband, and then he vanished. Some say he made it to England and was recognized by a group of workers at a lime quarry. They beat him savagely and threw him into a pit of quicklime, blinding him. Others say he ended his days as a blind beggar on the streets of London, calling out for coins, unrecognized and alone. There are stories, probably legends, that he was spotted years later, decades later, still wandering, still cursed, still alive, but wishing he were dead. But the truth is, no one knows. William Hare disappeared into the fog of history, and he was never seen again. There's no record of his death, no grave, no final accounting. He simply ceased to exist. Margaret Hare, William's wife, also received immunity. But like her husband, she was hated, hunted. She too fled Edinburgh and vanished. Some say she died in poverty. Others say she changed her name and lived quietly, carrying her secret to the grave. Helen MacDougall, Burke's common-law wife, was released with a verdict of not proven. Legally, she was free. Socially, she was destroyed. She tried to stay in Edinburgh but was recognised and attacked by mobs. She fled to Australia, some accounts say, starting over in a place where no one knew her name. She died unknown, unmourned, a ghost haunting the edges of history. Dr. Robert Knox, the man who had bought 16 bodies and asked no questions, was never charged with a crime. But his life was ruined anyway. His students abandoned him. His anatomy theatre, once the most popular in Edinburgh, became empty. His name became synonymous with greed and moral corruption. Mobs attacked his home. They burned effigies of him in the streets. They chanted his name like a curse. He received death threats. His career, built on brilliance and ambition, crumbled in a matter of weeks. He left Edinburgh in disgrace, moving to London, then Glasgow, never able to rebuild what he had lost. He spent the rest of his life trying to distance himself from Burke and Hare, insisting he had been a victim of their deception. But no one believed him. No one forgave him. He died in 1862, alone, bitter, still claiming innocence. But Edinburgh remembered, and Edinburgh did not forgive. Burke and Hare's crimes had a lasting impact that went far beyond their own fates. The scandal forced Parliament to confront the grotesque reality of how medical schools obtained bodies. In 1832, just 3 years after Burke's execution, the Anatomy Act was passed. It was a direct response to the murders. The new law allowed the bodies of the unclaimed poor, those who died in workhouses and hospitals with no family to bury them, to be used for anatomical study. It wasn't a perfect law. It still treated the poor as less than human, their bodies as property of the state. But it ended the need for grave robbing. It ended the black market for corpses. And most importantly, it removed the financial incentive for murder. Burke and Hare had killed 16 people, but in a twisted way, their crimes had led to a law that would prevent future killers from following the same path. The body snatchers had, inadvertently, changed medical science forever. But even with Burke executed, Hare vanished, and Knox disgraced. Questions lingered. Questions that have never been answered. How many victims were there really? Burke confessed to 16 murders. But many historians believe the true number was higher. The timeline doesn't quite add up. There are gaps. Weeks where Burke and Hare were seen spending money freely, but no bodies were delivered to Knox. Were there other anatomists they supplied? Other victims whose names we'll never know? Some estimates put the real death toll at 20, 30, or even more. Did other anatomists know? Knox wasn't the only anatomy lecturer in Edinburgh. Other schools, other teachers, also received bodies from suspicious sources. Were there other Burke and Hares operating in the city? Other suppliers who were simply never caught? How much did Knox really know? He claimed ignorance. He said he trusted his suppliers. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Mary Patterson's body was so fresh, so recognizable, that students identified her immediately. Daft Jamie was known to half the city. How could Knox not have suspected? The truth is, Knox almost certainly knew. He just didn't care. The bodies were too valuable. The science was too important. And in the cold calculus of progress, a few murdered poor people were an acceptable cost. And so the body snatchers of Edinburgh were destroyed. Burke was executed and dissected. Hare vanished into the shadows. The women fled in disgrace. Knox died in exile. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. But the city of Edinburgh never quite recovered from the horror that had happened in its streets. The dark winds and closes of the old town, already sinister, now felt haunted. The medical schools, once symbols of enlightenment, were forever tainted by the knowledge of how their specimens had been obtained. And in the lodging houses, the taverns, the dark corners where the poor and desperate gathered, a new fear took hold. A fear that the friendly stranger offering a drink might not be a friend at all. That the warm bed might be a trap. That kindness might be a mask hiding something monstrous. The body snatchers were gone, but the fear they created would linger for generations, because the question remained, whispered in the darkness. How many more were never caught? How many bodies were dissected without anyone ever asking where they came from? How many murderers smiled, collected their payment, and walked away into the fog? Edinburgh would never know for certain, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying truth of all. The body snatchers are long dead, but Edinburgh has never forgotten them. William Burke's skeleton still hangs in the Anatomical Museum at the University of Edinburgh. Tourists come from around the world to stare at his bones, to photograph the man who killed for science. He's still teaching anatomy nearly 200 years after his death. The ultimate specimen, the perfect irony. In the museum's collection, you can also see that pocketbook. Brown leather, worn with age, unremarkable at first glance. But read the label. Pocketbook made from the skin of William Burke, executed 28th January 1829. His skin, tanned and stitched, turned into a souvenir. The body snatcher became the body. But what happened to William Hare? That's where the story gets darker. After his release, Hare vanished. Some say he fled to England and was recognized by workers who threw him into a lime pit, blinding him. Others claim he was spotted begging on the streets of London, his eyes milky white, calling out for coins. There are whispers that he ended his days in a workhouse, dying alone, unclaimed, the very type of corpse that the Anatomy Act would have sent to a dissection table. Poetic justice, perhaps, or perhaps something more, because Hare's body was never found. No record of his death, no grave, nothing. He simply disappeared. And Dr. Robert Knox, the man who bought 16 murdered bodies and asked no questions, he escaped the law, but not the city's rage. Students burned him in effigy. Mobs attacked his home. He had to flee Edinburgh in the middle of the night, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. He spent the rest of his life in exile, moving from town to town, a ghost of his former glory. He died in London in 1862, bitter and forgotten. But before he died, he was plagued by nightmares, visions of his anatomy theatre, filled with corpses that wouldn't stay still, that opened their eyes on the dissection table, that whispered his name. Some say it was guilt. Others say it was something else. The lodging house on Tanner's Close where the murders took place no longer stands. It was torn down, the stones scattered. but the location is still there, in the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town. And locals will tell you, that spot is wrong. Tour guides avoid it after dark. Dogs refuse to walk past it. There's a coldness there, even on warm nights. And sometimes, people report seeing figures in the fog, a man and woman carrying something heavy between them, disappearing into the darkness of a close that no longer exists. The phrase burking entered the English language. It means to suffocate, to suppress, to silence. Don't burke the issue, people say, not knowing they're invoking the name of a murderer. William Burke's method, his technique, his legacy, spoken every day by people who've never heard his story. He wanted to be forgotten. Instead, he became immortal. But here's the truly terrifying part. Burke confessed to 16 murders, 16 victims over 10 months. But historians have never been satisfied with that number. The timeline doesn't work. The gaps between known victims are too long. The amount of money Burke and Hare spent doesn't match what they should have earned from just 16 bodies. How many more were there? How many nameless, faceless victims were delivered to Dr. Knox's table and dissected before anyone knew they were murdered? How many homeless? How many forgotten? How many people who disappeared into the Edinburgh fog and were never missed? We'll never know. The only men who knew the truth are dead or vanished. And Burke and Hare weren't alone. The London Burkers, the Bethnal Green Gang, other resurrection men across Britain who found that murder was easier than grave robbing. How many anatomists across the country were receiving suspiciously fresh corpses and asking no questions? How many medical students learned surgery on the bodies of murder victims, never knowing the truth? The corpse trade created a market for murder. And in the shadows of every medical school, in every anatomy theatre, there may have been suppliers who learned the same terrible lesson as Burke and Hare. The dead are worth more than the living. On foggy nights in Edinburgh's Old Town, locals say you can still hear it. The sound of something heavy being dragged across cobblestones, the creak of a tea chest, a knock on the door of a building that's no longer there. The body snatchers are gone, but the city remembers, the stones remember, and every skeleton in every medical school, every piece of knowledge about human anatomy was built on a foundation of murder. Progress demanded bodies, and men like Burke and Hare were happy to supply them. So the next time you're in Edinburgh, walking through the Old Town on a dark October night, and you hear footsteps behind you in the fog, don't look back. It might just be the wind. It might just be your imagination. Or it might be two Irishmen looking for their next delivery to the anatomy theatre. After all, Dr. Knox is long dead. But the market for bodies, that's eternal. And somewhere in the shadows, someone is always willing to supply the demand. If this story sent a chill down your spine, if you believe these dark tales from history's shadows deserve to be remembered, hit that like button and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. We dig up the stories that were meant to stay buried. What do you think happened to William Hare? Drop your theories in the comments below. Did he die blind and alone? Or is he still out there, wandering the fog, looking for one more victim? Thank you for gathering around the fire with us tonight. Until next time, remember, in the old streets of Edinburgh, when the fog rolls in, the dead aren't always in their graves. This has been the Midnight Archives.